When you think about cybersecurity, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably things like firewalls, complicated encryption, maybe some antivirus software, right? Well, today, we're going to dig into the most critical and honestly the most vulnerable part of any security system, and it's not a piece of tech at all.
So let me ask you a question straight up. What do you think is the single biggest threats to a company's security? Is it some shadowy group of hackers? A massive attack from another country? What is it?
Well, the answer is actually a lot closer to home. The single biggest security risk any organization faces is you and me. It's us, the people who are already on the inside.
Now, hold on, this isn't about pointing fingers or blaming anybody. It's about understanding a really core idea in security called the human firewall. See, security isn't just a technology problem to be solved. It's a whole system made up of business processes and, you guessed it, people. Today, we're going to break down exactly why people, not software, are the absolute heart of cybersecurity.
So where does this human firewall actually get built? Well, it starts at the very, very beginning. We're talking about how you design a job role in the first place, baking security principles right in from day one of an employee's life with the company, even from the moment the job ad is written.
The first bedrock principle is something called separation of duties. Basically, it just means you set things up so that no single person has the power to break a really important process all by themselves. You design the system so no one person acting alone can commit fraud or cause some huge disaster. It's a fundamental check and balance. And the best part is, this isn't some complex theory. You've seen it in action your whole life. Think about an old school department store. First, you pick out what you want and a salesperson writes up an invoice. Then, and this is key, you take that invoice to a totally different person, the cashier, to pay. Finally, you take your stamped receipt back to the first person to get your stuff. It's brilliant, right? The salesperson never touches the money, and the cashier never touches the merchandise. The chance for fraud just plummets. All right, the second big idea is called the principle of least privilege, and it's just as important. The concept is super simple but incredibly powerful. You only give an employee access to the things they absolutely need to do their job, nothing more. Every extra bit of access is just an unnecessary risk. It's like leaving a door unlocked for no good reason. Let's go back to our store example. The cashier, they can take your money and process a payment, but they can't give you a refund or a discount. To do that, they need to call over a supervisor. But, and here's where it all clicks together, that supervisor can't just run the checkout by themselves. So you have one person who can run the register and a separate person who can override it. That's separation of duties and least privilege working in perfect harmony to build a secure system. Okay, so you've designed the role perfectly from the get-go, but what about the day-to-day? This brings us to the never-ending challenge of managing the insider threat. This is where all those neat theories meet the messy reality of the daily grind.
So how do companies actually spot trouble brewing on the inside? Well, there are some pretty clever tricks. For instance, a lot of places require anyone who handles money to take all of their vacation time in one chunk. Why? Because it forces someone else to do their job for a full billing cycle, and that's when you might notice something fishy going on. It's a really smart process, and it works alongside other red flags like, doing background checks to see if an employee is suddenly living a lifestyle that their salary just doesn't support.
And of course, the modern world has thrown in some new curveballs, like the absolute nightmare that is BYOD, or bring your own device. Yeah, companies love it because it saves them money on laptops and phones. But from a security standpoint, oh man, it's a mess. How do you possibly protect sensitive company data when it's sitting on a personal phone right next to family photos? And what happens to all that data when the employee leaves? It's a huge, huge challenge. All this talk about insider threats leads to an even deeper question, because it's not always about bad guys. A lot of the time, the biggest risks come from good people just making honest mistakes. So let's dive into the psychology of the click. Why on earth do smart, capable people fall for really simple tricks, like phishing email? Okay, to get this, we need a super basic model of how our brain works. Think of it, just for a second, like a computer. We take in sensory input, what we see, what we hear. We have some internal processing where we think and make decisions, and then we generate an output, saying something or, clicking a mouse. But here's the catch. Think about when you first learned to drive a car. Every single action, checking the mirror, signaling, pressing the pedal, it all required your absolute full attention. But after a while, it just becomes automatic. You do it without thinking. Now, this automation is amazing for our brains. It's super efficient, but it has one massive downside. We start processing information on a much, much shallower level. And that's exactly where the danger sneaks in. That mental cruise control leads to a psychological process called habituation. It's basically when our brain's response to something we see over and over and over again, like, say, an email notification or a security pop-up, gets weaker every single time. Put simply, our brains literally learn to tune things out, even if that thing is a warning sign trying to protect us. There's a classic, kind of funny example of this from neuroscience, the aplysia sea slug. If you gently poke the slug, it flinches. But if you keep poking it gently, it realizes the poke is harmless and it just stops reacting. That's habituation in action. But then, give it one single sharp poke, and bam, its defensive response comes right back. That's called sensitization. So let's put this all together. This model shows exactly what's happening when a phishing email lands in your inbox. You're standing at a fork in the road, a cognitive crossroads. Path 1 is the automatic, habituated response. You see a link, you click it. You've done it a million times. That's how you get phished. That split-second decision is where billion-dollar data breaches are born. Path 2 requires you to stop, break that habit, and actually think about the email. That's deep cognitive processing. And that's how you stay safe.
So if our brains are naturally wired to take these dangerous shortcuts, how in the world do we fight back? Well, the good news is we can use that very same psychology to our advantage. We can actually rewire our security brain and build a way stronger human firewall. The way to do this follows a pretty clear 3-step framework. It starts with simple awareness, just getting the message out there. But that's not enough. So you move on to training, where you're actively building real skills. And the final goal is true education, where you develop a deep, lasting security mindset.
And here's the crucial difference. Look at this slide. On the left, you have an awareness campaign, a poster on the wall that says, "Don't share passwords." After a week, because of habituation, it becomes completely invisible. We just don't see it anymore. But on the right, you have effective training. It doesn't just throw a slogan at you. It actively builds muscle memory. It teaches you how to spot the sneaky signs of a real phishing attempt. It gives you skills, not just a reminder. We've covered the beginning of the employee journey, and we've talked about the middle. But now we have to talk about the end, the secure employee exit. This is an absolutely critical moment for managing risk, because it's when some of the biggest threats can pop up. And really, there are two totally different kinds of goodbyes. A friendly termination is planned, it's smooth, but an unfriendly termination, that is a high-risk security event. The moment an employee leaves on bad terms, every single bit of their access, physical and digital, has to be cut off immediately. Otherwise, you're vulnerable to sabotage, data theft, or even a logic bomb. That's malicious code left behind to go off weeks or months later. And if you think that's being dramatic, the consequences of getting this wrong are very, very real. There was a case in Australia where a disgruntled former employee hacked into a water services system and released raw sewage into local parks and rivers. The cost just to change the locks on the buildings afterward was over $55,000. And that doesn't even begin to cover the environmental damage or the total collapse of public trust.
So we've looked at the whole life cycle, from how a job is designed to the psychology of a single mouse click, all the way to an employee's last day. Your company definitely has a plan to manage its security, and you are a key part of that plan. But after hearing all of this, the real question is, do you?